We're going to do a bit of a pivot now, and I think it is really important to recognise that burnout can impact our friends in industry too. And I think Charlene's really mentioned that, but I'd like to sort of drill into that a little bit more. Charlene, as a global patient advocacy lead, what are you hearing from people and organisations in terms of their conflicts here and their ability to continue advocating in this difficult space?
So, in terms of adding to what's already been said, because I think we've covered, so many themes down to, even just the last one, Dan, and I know that you and I have talked about the stupid things that people say sometimes and, how we deal with them. But I think there's two things that I do want to pull out that haven't been touched maybe, and that is, I think there's something, so that take away the fact that the work of rare disease advocacy, and if we think about society at the moment, there is a big kind of badge of honor around busyness and, and success. There's writers have even described this, they've described this human period as, homo diffusus or something like this. There's a whole idea that success or the badge of honor is measured by tiredness and busyness. And, we do kind of move into this space sometimes. How are you? Oh my goodness, I'm so busy, and it becomes a little bit like that. And so one of the things that I've been hearing quite a lot from the rare disease space, and I'm not sure of the conclusion here, but I just want us to be aware of it, is it is being said quite a lot, that we are victims of our success, that actually we have got to a point now where we've achieved certain things that didn't exist 10 years ago. We're, pushing down time to diagnosis. We've got this many gene therapies on the development, or this is, and that we're victims to that success. And I think I just want to say, I don't know what I want to say exactly about this, but I think we need to be careful about what we are saying there, in terms of A, how we're measuring success, and then, maybe it's B, how we're talking to each other in that space of what, what's the marker here? What, is the marker? You can't be doing the work right unless you're absolutely exhausted, and just thinking about that. I don't know. I'm just throwing that out. It's a couple of ideas. And then I guess the other thing that I've heard a lot too, and this is another thing about what we say to each other and is often, when you're facing, when you're moving towards or leaning into burnout, as we're those sorts of phrases, people will say things like, oh, well, why are you sending emails after 5 p.m? Or why did you do that on the Saturday? Or all these things, like almost like what you're talking about, or all these sorts of issues, or you should not send, or don't send emails after 5 p.m, or don't take a call after 7 p.m, or things like that. And I think the thing there that's difficult is it becomes another thing that you're either trying to achieve or not do, or something like that. And it becomes another burden. And actually the reality of this space that we're working in is it doesn't fit in a 9-to-5 day. Nothing about it is 9 to 5. The realities, the complexities of it all do require, give and take across hours, across our expertise, across
The global nature of it, if nothing else, the time zones requiring that. If you said I don't work after 5, you can't connect with half the world.
Exactly. And in the rare disease space, we need to connect across the world. But also, in the rare disease space, as we've talked about, so many people have full-time jobs and then are doing this on top of that. Or, we're getting volunteers in who are holding down their full-time jobs and then trying to provide their expertise, which means you can only meet in the evenings or weekends to discuss certain projects or to discuss those sorts of things. So I think there's just a reality check there that, I'm hearing that it's not necessarily helpful to put these restraints on us in terms of, well, maybe you should, block out this, or maybe, it's like these can become a burden as well. And I'm not, it's a conflict really, because we want to be able to say, oh, actually, it's a good thing to not send emails after, in the weekend or things like that. But actually putting those constraints on are not in a space of reality, of the reality in which we're operating. And so it's just taking care in how maybe we communicate that, or communicate, so I get this constantly, oh, Shirlene, you really should practice some more self-care. And I said, well, it'd be great if you could give me
Have a bubble bath,
hours in the
Charlene.
day so I could.
And that just, Shirlene, that's a really good point you made about self-care. And actually, I was giving a talk and someone said, for this talk, I want you to tell her how awful this disease was, how awful it was for your daughter. That people need to really connect and understand how bad it was. And I remember going, well, fine, gave the talk, and I realized that I, by nature, speak positively about our experience with Emily, because it turned out it's self-care, it's a coping mechanism. So for me to remember her in pain, having to suction her 24/7, catheters, constant dystonia, is emotionally very difficult. And then someone to say you're talking too positively about this awful situation was a real wow, I never thought that we did that. And I look back and I remember every talk I give is relatively positive of Emily, and we never look at the bad side. And it is a self-care strategy that I'd obviously put into place without realizing it. So I never let these negative thoughts and emotions in until that point. And I was like, so it took a bit of time to come to terms, but then that's self-care, to think if someone asks you that, what's the strategy to, how do you respond? How do you deal with that? And I think that's very important. It's the same like the 5 p.m. emails. There's a reason it's happening. Like, what's the strategy? How do you respond to someone?
And I think people have a responsibility, and that's something I'd like, if we've got some industry listeners listening today, is, when you ask somebody to do that, to come and do a lunch and learn, or to disclose a vulnerable situation like that, every time they do that, you're giving so much emotionally of yourself to do that. Even for us 12 years later, it doesn't get any easier telling your story, and you still have that same emotional response to it. So you're bringing those emotions to the front every time you're asked to do that. So I think there needs to be a responsibility around that. And I think, from a Rare Rev point of view, when we're interviewing people, we're acutely aware that sometimes it's the first time somebody has actually said out loud their story, and it's a really emotional experience, and so you've got that responsibility to them. But then also, I guess, another side of it, which I think would lead in quite nicely, Kim, and to Charlene, is then how do we manage that emotional side on the other side? So, for our team, work days can be really emotional, whether it's the action for XP or at Rare Rev, because of the emotional situations you're dealing with hearing people, and Charlene, obviously, you said, getting calls at 5 a.m. to get devastating news in the capacity of your job. That's really difficult to cope with, that kind of emotional toll and sort of almost secondary trauma. So Kim, what sort of strategies can professionals and sort of more charity leaders put in place to deal with that? Because we're not trained, are we? Nobody gives you the training as to how to deal with all of this endless pain and suffering that you're navigating through as an untrained person.
Well, I think the first step is, as you're describing, Nicola, is recognizing the potential for that impact on yourself as a listener, and as someone who's supporting someone else, perhaps in telling their story or being exposed to really, really, difficult and upsetting experiences, and sometimes shocking and traumatic experiences. Even within my team, who are trained and supported, sometimes, we sit down and go, oh my goodness, this is our job. We're well supported. We have supervision. We have peer group, case discussions. The impact and the emotional impact is still, tremendous. And that potential for vicarious trauma out there in frontline working is very real. So I think it first starts with the potential for it always being there. But I think, going back to what Charlene was saying, something about that check-in with each other as colleagues, and I know I sometimes forget too. I've got members of my team where they may have heard something that resonates very powerfully with their own experience, because a lot of us in this space are working from lived experience around rare conditions. But even if we're not, often we've got other experiences of others, circumstances and lives around loss or trauma or relationship breakdown. We don't do this work in a vacuum. It is impactful. And I think just normalizing when we're working in a space where we're listening to difficult experiences of life and great resilience often in the face of it, but really impactful, and how impactful it is on us as individuals too. But start with that kind of building in. How are we all doing? How did it feel to hear that? Are you okay? And it doesn't take much. It's just that kind of like, oh, are you okay? And I know for myself, if I'm finding something a bit like, oh, that was a lot, that's a sign that I might then check in with my team and say, that was hard to hear, how are you all doing? Or, how did that land with you? So that's something about just normalizing the care of each other when we're faced with hearing difficult experiences that will inevitably, resonate with our own. So yeah, I suppose just normalizing it. I keep going back to that. Let's be talking about it more, not in a kind of like, oh, wringing hands way, but just, yeah, this stuff is hard.
And Charlene, how do you manage that within your team? Is there kind of a procedure in place? Is it just something that's organically evolved between you and your colleagues, that kind of checking in? Or is there something in place, as an organizational structure to recognize and to help with that side of the emotional toll of your role?
Well, I think so. Piarella is my number one teammate, and I think she's listening on this call, but we often say we cry a lot. And that's okay. It's sometimes the eyes work, and that's how we react. And that's okay to hold space for each other and that. But I think the other point that I wanted to raise a little bit was what you said, Kim, is that we don't do this work in a vacuum as well. So, one of the things that I think is important, well, again, I'm going back to all these dichotomies, but we talk about work-life balance as though these are discrete things. But of course, work impacts us. It is our life as much as life is our life. And I think, these experiences are not something that we can bracket in some ways. We work out tools, as Dan was talking about, self-care tools by which we can manage them. But I think that's something that I think is really important to remember. And certainly in my family, we talk about this a lot, that it's not my boys will say, oh, Mama, are you crying about that little boy again? And it's like, yeah, and it's something that we do in the family as well and share. And I guess that's where I wanted to kind of go in terms of what are the tools and resources available. I think each of us, Dan, you talked about this in terms of having friends outside of the community as well. And that's the point that I'm getting to in terms of this is all life, that actually I need to have friends who are not at work as well, but who and are maybe not in the rare disease space, but who I can talk about this with, who I can ring up and go, this is, who will listen. And that's what life is. Life is about that sharing and having those people. And I strongly believe in micro acts. I think, not all of us are going to go to an organization, or not all of us are going to seek out counseling at different points in time. We will deal with things in our own way. There's different ways of dealing it. And I think sometimes it's a micro act. Sometimes it's about, I just need to go outside today and just be outside for a bit, or we have this joke in our family that if it comes to a weekend after a particularly bad, I'll build a bonfire. We'll have a big bonfire outside.
Well, I think that getting outside is a really important thing, isn't it? Just actually the power of that. I did an interview recently with Effie Parks, who does a fabulous podcast, Once Upon a Gene, and we're looking at encouraging people to just get out and take a walk, get out of the house, get out of your headspace. And I think, we don't put enough importance, going back to that self-care, we all go, oh yeah, I'd love to take a bubble bath and be really relaxed and all of that. But, actually sometimes just something as simple as even opening the window and getting a bit of air and connecting with the outside can actually be really powerful. So I'd like to just, before we move on to kind of solutions, because I want to make sure we leave time for what that might be. I just want to talk a little bit about some of these external pressures and extra workload things that I think are contributing to this. With this, we talked about this ever in professionalizing organizations and patient advocacy movement. You know, and Helen, are you seeing this in terms of, you know, historically charities weren't driving cures and research, but now we're seeing that more so. Are you feeling the pressure that as an organization, that's something you need to be involved in? Do you think you need to be involved in? Is it the right place sitting with charities, or are we taking on too much burden from, you know, other bodies that should be driving this?
I think from our point of view, I mean, that's where we started. So we started from that point and have worked in the opposite direction to supporting families. So our original sort of mission, I suppose, was selfish in that respect, is that we just wanted a treatment for Oliver. That's what we wanted. That was why we were here. That was the reason for us to be in this game. But obviously, as time's gone on, that's changed, and we are very much here to support the community and realise and recognise the power of being part of a team, and our community is our team. So I mean, the problem with being very rare, and we are ultra rare, we're 1 in a million, that a lot of the research does need to be funded by charities, either sort of our charity or the international FOP charity, because we don't get money from governments and the NHS to support, because you're only going to help so many people. And the fact that research into rare has such massive implications for all conditions, and what they learn about one rare condition, it has, you know, they can then use that learning to support so many other conditions. And particularly in the case of FOP, it's to stop this unwanted bone growth, but that's spontaneous heterotopic ossification, which occurs in so many other parts of, you know, sort of medicine. So you're not just, at that point, once you start looking bigger, you're not just looking at the rare picture, you're looking at more. But unless you're one of the big charities with the, you know, that gets the government funding, then the rest of us are all just trying to do our very best. There's not even a pot of money that we can apply to for just being rare. So if we don't do it, who will? And that is your problem. And that was the situation that we took on many years ago now as a charity, was that the funding for research in the UK, without fundraising through a charity or patient group, the research couldn't have continued in the UK. So that is our role, and it's still very much like that today. So if we don't do it, nobody else, in many cases, for many rare diseases, nobody will, because it is such a niche market. It shouldn't be, but that's the reality that we are in today. And as it's been mentioned before, with the cost of living, it just becomes increasingly difficult to ask people. And very often with rare conditions, it's a handful of families who are doing all the heavy lifting, and there's only so many times you can ask the same friends to sponsor you, to donate, to give a gift, because otherwise, you know, you start worrying whether people are going to cross the street when they see you, because they know you're just there with an ask. I mean, there's lots of talk in government about the rare disease framework, but it doesn't come with money, and everything takes so much time, and they've got to talk about it and review it, and it just doesn't happen as quickly as we need it to. And that in again has a cost implication for small charities and small patient organisations. We're fortunate to become part of the Adult Rare Bone Disease Network just recently that was set up, but that's zero funded. But you know, the care for adult patients is crucial. But if you know, think there's such massive underfunding everywhere, that there is unfortunately a need for charities to get involved. It's not right, but there's a reality about it, isn't there? And if we don't do it, who will? And if nobody does it, then where are you left? So unfortunately, that's where we are today.
And Dan, obviously there's also a big drive now in terms of that regulatory involvement. So NICE and the FDA, and now charities who are now actively working on that, you know, and you mentioned this before, kind of alluded to some of these things taking you away from the patient support stuff. You know, what's your view on that? Is it worth the trade-off, or is this a big distraction that is impacting the core services that are the priority?
No, you've got to do risk and reward. What if you're going to be dedicating time to something? What's the actual reward going to be to the community? is it actually going to make an impact, or is it just virtue signaling? Is it just joining something to say you're a member of something? And again, we were probably guilty of this at the very beginning, where we would be involved in this, literally anything that was happening in rare disease, because we thought we should. But actually, in hindsight, there are some battles that we can take up the fight and be successful in, and there's others we can't because we don't have the size, the time, or even the expertise. And I think that all comes with experience, but also speaking to your colleagues around you, people who are going through it at the same time. Can you come together? Can one person take on that battle? We look at newborn screening as a good example. We're part of a newborn screening collective, because individually, we can't have a voice. No one wants to listen to a disease that's one of 320,000. When you pull your resources together to actually fight newborn screening as a group, you can actually make change. And I think it's understanding where you as a group can make impact. And on the regulatory side, I get on my high horse on this one very quickly. There needs to be change. We need to be listened to. You can't expect advocacy to support a community, support clinicians, support research, and then not listen to them. You know, we talk about anything when it comes to endpoint selection, trial design, recruitment. And then when push comes to shove, they revert back to type and go tried and tested methods, which are 10, 15, 20 years old. You're asking companies to be innovative. You're asking researchers to be innovative in what they're doing. You won't accept the innovation, actually, when it comes to the trials or moving things forward. So there needs to be sea change. And what I've seen in advocacy in many groups is this realization that we need to make change together. We can't try and do this on our own. So if we're looking at groups of diseases which are similar, and we all know that sleep's an issue, let's not just look at sleep individually, look at, can we use that as an endpoint for all of these different diseases? Then all of a sudden the regulator's getting proposals from multiple companies and multiple disease areas on this one endpoint selection. That's what we can do in advocacy, how we can come together and make change. And I think those are battles we can take up together, but everyone needs to be on the same page that you're working together without, obviously, your community suffering. I think that's the big step that many of us need to really make, is to ensure that our communities always get the support they need.
And go back to that collaboration is king really here, isn't it?